My presentation today is about Special Forces training Cambodian Infantry in Vietnam. And I call it an unsung mission because in all the histories about Special Forces in Vietnam, it comes out as pretty much a footnote or an oh by the way. And also, as far as I know, this is the first audio-visual presentation of the material that we're going to talk about today about this particular mission. And as far as I know, it's only appeared twice in print. So I hope you enjoy this and get some unusual and new information. This is my background. I was a sergeant in the Signal Corps. I applied for OCS, for Signal Corps OCS, and was sent to Infantry OCS. For a short, brief period, I was a training officer cooling off from OCS, and then in early '68, I went to Vietnam. I started out as a mortar platoon leader, a couple of months. Then I went to an exciting assignment as a reconnaissance platoon leader. I've given a previous presentation about that. And then, the chance of a lifetime, I got to be an infantry company commander in the field. Maybe the world's best job, but I don't know. Came back and was at the training center at Fort Knox as a training officer on the general staff. It was the Armor Center. I knew I was going back to Vietnam for another tour. It was a very boring place to be, so I decided to control my destiny and volunteer for Airborne and Special Forces, which I did. That brought me back to Vietnam in October of '70. And that's what this presentation is going to focus on. So I was there for 18 months as a Special Forces A-Team leader and an operations officer, S3. After returning to the States, I spent an additional 9 years in Special Forces assignments, A-Team leader, B-Team company commander, staff officer, and reserve component advisor. My replacement at that job was Ham Sally, sitting in the back there. Taught him everything he knows, still doesn't know anything. Can you make this go full? So what we're going to, how we're going to handle this, we'll talk a little bit about how Special Forces functions and is organized. We'll look at Cambodia, since this deals with Cambodians. We'll look at the setup in Vietnam, and we'll look at the birthing pains of this new program, and then we'll run through some anecdotes as we have some time available. So if this is hard to read, I'll help you out with it. One of the first Special Forces missions is to conduct unconventional warfare. This means warfare other than the classic World War II in Korea situation, where you had a big group over here of enemy defending and the good guys attacking, or vice versa. So this was other types of operations in that straightforward attack-defense situation. The next one is to teach indigenous people. That just simply means people that live in a specific country. It doesn't mean the Indians or like the Maori in the South Pacific. So what this implies is to organize them, train them, lead them in guerrilla warfare. What this implies is that we're trying to help overthrow an unfriendly government by organizing their citizens and leading them. The next one talks about the same situation with indigenous people, but it's the other side of the coin, working against guerrilla groups and insurgents that are trying to attack a friendly government. So we attack them and we defend them. The third one is what we call direct action missions. This may be something like reconnaissance or doing some type of, for example, like we did in training the Cambodians. The two middle ones that discuss organizing the indigenous personnel is what we call a force multiplier. That means that we take a small group of American Special Forces, we put them in a foreign country, and we recruit large numbers of those people to do a specific task. So in that way, we don't have to send in that same large force of Americans to do that job. Can you give me an advance here on this? Okay, one back, please. And in Vietnam, some of those other special missions, we had Mobile Strike Force, or MIC forces. And these were the reaction force in each one of the core areas, which I'll show you in a minute, for U.S. and Special Forces units that were in trouble. They were the fire brigade. Then we had the very famous, very well written about Studies in the Operations Group, or SOG. These guys, in small groups and with the locals, the indigenous people, 5, 7 men, would go across the fence, as we say. In other words, into Laos, Cambodia, and North Vietnam. Very hairy missions. And then the last one here is what we're going to discuss today, is doing special training missions. Now we're going to take a look at how Special Forces was organized. Can I get in advance? Okay, here's the basic unit of Special Forces, the A-Team. You've heard about it. It's 12 guys. Let's see how they're organized in a minute. Okay, this is the one back, please. One forward. Okay, this is the operational grouping of a Special Forces A-Team, the specialties of the NCOs. And you can see that it starts out with weapons specialists. That means not only U.S., but foreign weapons. Think AK-47 and Uzis and other less well-known weapons. The medics were the most well-trained. They had the longest training period, a year long and more. They were authorized to perform minor surgery. So these guys were really good. They were good to have around. Commo guys, they run radios and they encrypt stuff and call in helicopters when you really need to get out of a tight spot. Engineers, they're known as demo men. Why? Because they like to blow stuff up. But also they have skills in building, like bridges, schools, hospitals, and so forth. There was 2 NCOs in each specialty, an E7 and an E6, although sometimes in some places over the years, the E6s might drop down to E5s. And normally all A-teams were manned by those ranks. They were usually, my experience was, they were never up to that full capacity. And then you could call this the headquarters element. The other 4 guys on the A-team, the team leader was a captain. XO, executive officer, was a lieutenant. In my personal experience as an A-team leader, I never had an XL for reasons I never understood. The senior NCO is Master Sergeant, Operations Sergeant. He's where the team leader gets dazed and confused. This is the guy he goes to get straightened out. Then finally there's the intelligence sergeant, a very important person in a combat situation. Now in Vietnam, the A-teams on the ground had a number of missions. You see up here, they built fortified A camps. A is named after the A-team. And they would recruit the local villagers to form a sort of militia. And we call it the Civilian Irregular Defense Group. Of course, we didn't call it like that. We called it SIDG, naturally, in the military. So they would be of various ethnic origin. In Vietnam, there were a lot of ethnic groups. And it was, we tried real hard not to mix them because we didn't always get along. These camps, the A camps, were initially intended as self-defense, as I said, like a militia. And they would be mostly part-time. And they would be out working in the field, and something would happen, and they would all gather into the actual A camp itself. I'll show you one in a minute. And and we tried to place these camps on known infiltration routes for the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong would be infiltrating from other countries into South Vietnam. Eventually, most of these groups, instead of being defensive in nature, began to do aggressive operations, going out looking for the bad guys and clearing them out of the area. So we kind of call that activity pacification, controlling the area for the South Vietnamese government. Here's two typical A camps. The one on the left is Bù Đắp, and you can see it's just a simple square, and just on the right side of that you can maybe make out the airstrip, which most camps had for resupply. And over on the right you see a very complex configuration, and this would be manned by more or less permanent SIDG people. And in the middle of that star, you can see another smaller star. This would be the inner compound, sort of the last holdout, and this would be where the Americans would live. This would be this dispensary in there, the arms room and storage of mortars and so forth. So there's a pretty wide gamut in terms of how these things were figured, and there was everything in between. So the next step up from the A-team was the B-team. The B-team supported the A-teams. They did everything. They had all the specialists of the A-team plus these other functions, such they had the administration would be there, transportation, mess, and a higher level of medical support. So sometimes the A teams would be co-located with them, and sometimes the B teams would be on their own. Then the C team is the next level up, and they control the B teams. Commanded by a lieutenant colonel, and they did everything that the B teams did, plus they would provide aviation support and liaison. In other words, if you needed a helicopter or you needed tactical air, this is where it came from. Then at the top, there was Special Forces Group headquarters. In Vietnam, it was the 5th Special Forces Group. And they had the big picture functions. They would receive missions from the higher command, for example, MAC-V in Vietnam. They would coordinate with other services. For example, they might request naval gunfire. They might request tactical air from the Air Force. Or we had some interaction with Marines as well. And finally, they would provide an interface with the host country. So this is where, although this happened at all levels, this interface was at the high-level leadership at a particular host country. Now here's South Vietnam. I mentioned the core areas, and you can see them kind of north to south, starting at the top, First Corps, known as I Corps. These are also known as military regions. And you can kind of get an idea of the bordering countries, which we'll see a little bit in detail later. So here was how these units were deployed by numbers and locations in Vietnam. So the group headquarters, there was one of those, and then located in the Trang. The C teams had one each in each of the core areas that I just showed you. And then the B teams were dispersed through the core areas as you see there, between 4 and 6. And then finally the A teams had a total of 191 A camps that they built. These didn't exist simultaneously. Some of the A teams had to build sequentially up to 4 different camps. So and sometimes the A teams were co-located with the B teams. But this just gives you an idea of the extent of how many and how active these A teams were. So we're going to talk about, this is about training Cambodian infantry. Let's take a look at Southeast Asia here. See, Cambodia is green, small country, kind of squeezed in. You got Vietnam, this is all of Vietnam, north and south. On the right, in blue, you have Laos in the brown, and you have Thailand there in the sort of gray. So the country is surrounded, except for a small, down in the lower left area there, a small area of coastline. So this, the fact of being almost completely encapsulated had, as you will see, some effect on how, on the history of the country. One back, please. Now, in the background for a little bit about Cambodia, it's an ancient culture. It had well-developed civilization. As I mentioned, it was surrounded by, almost completely by its sometimes stronger neighbors. So the territory would move back and forth. They were squeezed. The French came in 1863 and colonized the area, as they did much of the other areas in Southeast Asia. So they exercised control up until 1953. We'll see what happened after that. But during that period, in World War II, the Japanese came in and occupied Cambodia and more or less overwhelmed the French until their defeat in 1945. It became an independent kingdom in 1953 as a result of the Geneva Conference on Indochina. In the mid-60s, by the mid-60s, the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong had established bases in Cambodia along its eastern border with Vietnam. And they used their facilities there to launch attacks into South Vietnam, and then they would go back into Cambodia to those places as a sanctuary. So it was for us, it was a pretty untenable situation. And along that small coastline I pointed out, there's a port of Sihanoukville where the North Vietnamese and the VC would bring in their supplies, transfer them across the country to that border area where they had their facilities. And there was off and on from 1969, the U.S. tried to bomb these facilities, but I can't say that it was particularly effective. Now here's a major actor in Cambodia. You may have heard his name, Norodom Sihanouk. He became king in 1941. After they had taken over Cambodia in 1941 from the French, Sihanouk became king. As the Japanese were winning in defeat in 1945, they declared Cambodia to be an independent kingdom and walked out the door. However, the French immediately came back in and established control over Cambodia. So they were not independent any longer. During the war in Vietnam, Sihanouk would not allow U.S. forces to enter the country. That meant that those facilities of the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong just inside the Cambodian border could not be touched by us. Even though he allowed those communist VC and North Vietnamese to be inside the country, the communist Cambodians, known as the Khmer Rouge, or Red Cambodians, still opposed him on a variety of reasons. And so did the moderates within the country. And so did the right-wing establishment. So Sihanouk was pretty unpopular. And this resulted in a coup in March of 1970. He was deposed while he was out of the country. So the Khmer, or Cambodian Republic, was declared after the Sihanouk coup. When he left, they said, no more kingdom, we now have a free republic. They immediately, this is actually run mostly by the military, they immediately established the friendly relations with our country, and the new regime demanded the withdrawal of those VC facilities on the border. The VC and NVA responds ferociously and attacked and secured even more territory along the border. They pushed more deeply into Cambodia and controlled quite a bit of those eastern provinces. So the government asked us for assistance. You may remember the Cambodian incursion, very unpopular. President Nixon had quite a problem on his hands after that. And we also agreed to train the Cambodian military. And that's where the bulk of this is going to come in. So here's the plan. First of all, the Cambodian Army, it was a Royal Cambodian Army, was redesignated, as you see here. This in French. You're welcome to take a try at it. but it was abbreviated as FANC. We'll call it that from now on, the Cambodian Army. Its previous acronym was FUNC, so I'm kind of glad they changed it. The FANC, as it stood at that time, was very undermanned, and what they did have, the veterans did not have extensive combat experience, so it was weak. They decided to institute aggressive draft system to fill the ranks and expand FANC. And the training was to be done by U.S. forces, special forces, but it had to be done outside Cambodia. You may remember the Cooper Church Amendment that was in place at that time in early 1970 that said, yes, we're going to help you, but no American forces can enter Cambodia. I think we need to go back. Oh, okay, go ahead. Okay. The idea was that the Cambodian battalions to be trained would be brought into Vietnam, and they would be taken to secure areas, of which that's a relative term, and they would go into camps that have been vacated by other special forces operations, including the Mike Force. We had special forces personnel available.
Step right up this, because I think as you turn, it gets sometimes it gets squeal. I'm trying to.
We had special forces personnel to be involved in this program because the aid camps that I talked to you about before were being turned over to the Vietnamese under the Vietnamization program. So those people were available. We had the Night Force that we talked about. Most of them were ethnic Cambodians who, when the Republic was declared, were shipped en masse back to Cambodia to help out with FANC. And plus, there was a very robust training program in the U.S. to train special forces personnel. Most of that pipeline were the lower grade NCOs, but they were on the way. So we had the facilities, we had the men, and we also, when we talked about the special forces missions, that was one of our missions, to train counterinsurgency and counter-guerrilla activities, which was what the VC was viewed as at that time. And finally, we had the Cambodian commanders speaking interpreters that were available for all these same reasons. So this is how the plan was set up. The units would come over organized as battalions. They would consist of 512 men. This was kind of it was an onus for them because they had a French-style battalion organization, very support-heavy, and they had to reduce it down to this 512, which is what our Night Force organization was like. The training program was to last for each battalion for 12 weeks. That's it. We'll come back to that in a minute. The battalions would arrive at the training facilities at 1 week intervals until that facility had reached its capacity. So there was 4 battalions capacity. Every 4 weeks, a new battalion would arrive. And then At the end of 12 weeks, that trained battalion would get on aircraft, take it to the battalion command, and then bring back a fresh battalion to start their training program. So there was always a continuous line of training going on all the time. There was never a break. And then the concept was for one A team to train one battalion. And this is like what happened in the A camps and what happened with the Light Force. Here where the camps were located, 2 in 3 Corps, Dongbatin and Lockhart. And the one over on the left there, Chi Lang, you see it on the Cambodian border. And this was not eventually what was considered a secure area. And they had to move after a nasty situation where some Americans and Cambodian trainees were killed. And it moved to the long line there on the lower right. So I showed up at Long High in October of 70, and I'm assigned to an A team, A361. And they were training some Cambodians. It was not part of the official program. I don't know how it happened. That's why there's a question mark. I don't know how or why it happened. But nevertheless, they were training some Cambodian Infantry. We were assigned, my A team, to receive the 1st Battalion, very first Fang Battalion to come to Vietnam. So we were the guinea pigs. And that 1st Battalion, as I had mentioned before, consisted of a few veterans, and the rest were all draftees. Now this is the camp where I was assigned, Camp Long High. You can see the mountains in the background, and between the camp and the mountains, a lot of empty spaces. And this was where the ranges, firing ranges, and the maneuver training areas were located. They were formerly rice paddies. And if you look around the perimeter of that square, you see buildings. This is where, in this particular compound, 2 battalions were housed. And you kind of see a center area there. This was the inner compound where the Americans and all the support facilities were located. Then there's a little narrow road running down there, and you can just see part of the south compound. This is the south compound, much the same as the north compound. It had a 2 battalion capacity. So here let's talk about, this is the part that has not seen the light of day in a situation like this before. One of the issues right away was 12 weeks to train a battalion. You want us to start out with basic training, and at the end of 12 weeks you have this battalion trained to attack and defend as a unit. Are you joking? Look at what the U.S. training program, this part of it was, 8 weeks of basic training, 8 weeks of advanced infantry training, and you got women infantrymen. That's 16 weeks, as opposed to the 12 we were allocated for an entire battalion. The solution to this was, sorry, there was no solution. This is what was negotiated initially at the highest level, and this is the way it's going to be. So, don't call us. The next thing was, the program was vague. And it was vague because the A teams, as I mentioned, were expected to train these battalions. One A team, one battalion. But there were certain requirements, certain givens that we had to adhere to. One of which was a field training exercise, or FTX, was scheduled for week 3. Now, a field training exercise is where you take everybody out into the field. Not those training areas right next to Lockhart that we saw, but out in the field. And so, as I mentioned, the other part is the A teams had a lot, outside of these certain givens, the A team was allowed to sort of create their own program.
5 minutes.
So, how did we know this was a problem? We had a training area that was about 40 kilometers from Lockhart. It was pacified, theoretically. We were on week 3, after 2 weeks of training, in a truck convoy. And it was very difficult. The new Fed leaders were having trouble getting everybody organized, getting into their individual units, getting them dispersed. So, the Americans had to step in. We eventually got them to a location where they made a perimeter, essentially a circle, and they put out observation posts, which are 3 or 4 men outside the perimeter to detect anybody that might be coming to attack the perimeter. So after nightfall, one of the OPs thought they detected movement, somebody out there. They ran back in panic to the perimeter. Firing breaks out, blindly. Nobody knows why they're firing, and it slowly spreads around the perimeter until everybody is firing. And they're firing and they're not stopping, and the Fed officers couldn't make them stop. And pretty soon, the M79 grenade launchers were firing, and then the mortars were firing. And it didn't take me long to figure out that here we are, out in the middle of nowhere in Vietnam. We don't know what's going on. I have 512 guys here who are going to end up with no ammunition. It was like a problem back in OCS, when they gave this whole scenario and said, what are you going to do now, Lieutenant? Well, the only thing we had to do was request a complete battalion's worth of ammunition to be flown out to us at night, in who knows what type of circumstances. So, what our solution was to resolve or revise the training program. We were so close to trying to figure out how to implement this program that we never actually looked at the program itself from a distance and say, you know what? Training all these draftees for 2 weeks and then taking them out to the field in a who knows what kind of an area, that's probably not a good idea. And it turned out that it really wasn't a good idea based on what happened. So what we did was, we said, if this is a basic training to battalion the attack, what does that look like with the American U.S. Army training plan? How many, and I already told you about the basic training and advanced individual training. What about the squad training, the platoon training, the company training? How does that all work if we in the American Army. So we looked at that and we shrunk it down proportionally into 12 weeks. Not an ideal situation, but better than taking 2-week training people to the field in the third week. And this is a training plan. It's progressive. You can see where it goes from individual to squad to platoon to company. And then in week 8, we go to the field for an FTX after 7 weeks of training. Then we come back and we train for 10 days in battalion level. And then in week 11, we go back out to the field. So, we did one other thing. I'll just do this briefly. It turns out when we bring in all these special forces individuals in from different places, and the A teams had to train a battalion, it turned out they had uneven skills. And that's just the way it was. We had a lot of young, inexperienced people. We had some older NCOs. So what we decided to do is, once again, look at what the U.S. Army did. It took we took the most experienced NCOs out of the A teams and created a training committee. And we left half the NCOs back with the battalions as a sort of cavalry. Think of them as the drill sergeants. So every U.S. school, including at Fort Bragg, training special forces, use this concept. Training committee focuses on certain training aspects. We have the, quote, drill sergeants or cavalry taking care of administration and other things. So this gives a lot of focus, because we have the best guys teaching the stuff they do the best. And they taught it to every battalion, so every battalion got an equal amount, a level amount, the same training. Those same guys would evaluate all the battalions in their specialty. And then finally, we had the interpreters could also specialize. They didn't have to have all of the skills in the battalion, which was very difficult for them. So we're in a time situation here. And I'd like to just wrap up with the fact that in the end, Fang, despite all our efforts, was defeated. And the Khmer Rouge took over the country. And this has been looked at and analyzed. And I have to say that no one, no analyst, no historian, no armchair quarterback has faulted our FANC training program of Special Forces. In fact, I can stand here and say that all of us put into this program the type of training that we give to our own families. And so I am very proud to have been part of this program. It was a unfortunate defeat for all of us. We felt the same defeat that the FANC did, but in the end, that was the fate. So,
yeah. It's 1:15, so we've got for 45 minutes, so.
okay. So that's the, I don't know if you have some questions? Yes.
How long did the Khmer Rouge get along with the BC?
They kind of a back and forth. They sometimes fought against each other, but the Khmer Rouge wanted to control Cambodia, and the BC wanted to keep their facilities there, their bases. So it was a kind of a love-hate relationship.
Well, in the 60s, down in the Delta area, the BC would go down and rob a town and the residents of the town. And the next week, the Cambodians would come over from Cambodia in Vietnam and take what was left over. So the residents were always fighting one group or the other.
That's right, I agree, and, but they never probably came together at the same time.
What was this special forces CCN in May, Harlem Mountain? Was that a C group, or was that?
It was probably a launch location, maybe, where they went, they kicked off patrols, assault patrols across the border. I don't know for sure.
That was on that side, and it was next to Marble Mountain, and they got overrun, and August of 1960, there suffered a lot of deaths at that time. But then they continued operations at the Yancey Road that restore launches into Laos and also sometimes from Vietnam.
Okay, well, just,
What was the motivation of all those draftees? I mean, why were they willing to come over there? Did they have a choice?
no.
And so what was their motivation? I mean,
Their motivation was, once they were in, they were all in, and their motivation was to stay alive.
okay.
They were very good soldiers. They just didn't have enough time to get it all together. So it was, I don't know what to tell you more than that. Okay, thank you very much for your attention.